mini-series I'm going to do responding to one specific video by a content creator named GLM. This content creator goes through 7 verses or groups of verses to make 7 specific claims on why the biblical text contradicts Mormonism. What I would like to do in this video and also throughout my entire channel when I'm working with things like this is to approach it from more of an academic, linguistic, or scholarship groundwork or a framework, because that creates a better framework or a ground to go off of when we're debating something. If we get into faith-based things, we're going too much off of presuppositions that we can't really prove. For example, people want to prove or give good evidence that Christ was resurrected. Okay, the reality is, as much as it might be uncomfortable to hear, there is not, at least what we would say in the academic world, there's not good evidence that Christ was actually resurrected. That is a faith-based belief. I believe that with all of my heart, but that's a faith-based belief. There's not good actual evidence for that. Okay, there's not things that we can draw up to try and prove that. Okay, obviously there are some things, but there's not good evidence for it. Okay. So there's a few themes I'm going to touch upon as I go through this when it comes to the academics. One of those being that you can't make a text answer a question that the author simply is not asking. We're going to talk about that in the first video right here. Actually, we will hit upon we'll hit upon that subject. Another thing is that it's important to understand that the Bible, religiously, when we're talking about faith, is written for us. Okay. But academically, it's important to remember that the Bible is not written to us. Okay, biblical writers and authors, in their minds, even though inspired word, I would agree with, they are writing to a particular audience, culture, framework, worldview, and that becomes very easy to get confuddled in with ours, where we don't understand the true exegesis or what the original author was trying to say. Okay, and I'm sure we'll hit upon some other things that will come to me as we go through. But with that said, we're going to hit the first part. So
Here are 7 verses I love to use in evangelism to Mormons. First is Romans 11, verses 33 through 36. This has become one of my favorite texts as of late. And the reason is, first, because it's not intended initially to just be this theological statement. It's actually a statement of praise and worship. After Paul walks through the essence of the gospel in Romans chapter 1 through Romans chapter 11, he bursts out in this praise of God. In Romans 11, 33 through 36, Paul says this, "Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God! How unsearchable are his judgments, and how inscrutable his ways. For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor, or who has given a gift to him that he might be repaid? For from him, and through him, and to him are all things. To him be glory forever. Amen." I love this verse because it glories in the nature of God. God is a God that has never been known, never been counseled, never been given a gift. He is the source and origin of everything, and he is the reason everything exists. Now, within Latter-day Saint theology, there's...
Okay, so as this content creator specifically says, we're dealing with a hymn of praise here. This is at the end of chapters 1 through 11 of Romans, where Paul gives a very long, quite difficult talk to kind of flow from one point to another. It takes some work to understand it all, but it ends with this hymn of praise. Though this is not a theological treatise that the Apostle Paul is trying to make. He's speaking in adoration. Okay, so as he quotes, so it says, "For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor, or who has given a gift to him that he might be repaid?" Okay, so the argument that's being made is, no one has known God's mind. No one has been his counselor. No one has given God a gift. Okay, so therefore, God could not have had a father. Okay, and so obviously, final conclusion. Therefore, Mormon theology contradicts Paul in Romans. So the main issue with this is that Paul is not, well, as I said, he's not giving a theological treaty. You can't get an answer from a text. You can't get an answer of a question from a text that the text is not itself trying to actually ask. Okay, so this passage isn't asking if God has a father. It's not discussing God's genealogy, origin, or how God exists. What Paul is doing is he's rhetorically questioning and asking about humans' relationship with God. Okay, so we're talking about who can concern God's wisdom, counsel, as human beings. Okay, that's what Paul is referring to. This is a relationship between humans and God. Okay, again, you can't make a text answer something that it's not trying to actually ask. Okay, so, and the Apostle Paul is, well, it's thought that he's drawing from Isaiah chapter 40, verse 13 on this text. As most people probably know, Paul is very, what's the term I'm looking for? It's escaping me, but he knew the sacred writings. He's very familiar with them. So he would often quote from what we would now call the Old Testament. Okay, so it's a lot like, I'm going to try and think of a way to put this. Like you have, so maybe a good analogy. If someone says, okay, so John has never needed anybody in this company to ever tell him how to do his job. Okay. And then someone says, see, that obviously proves that John's father never taught him anything. Okay, you can draw a conclusion out of that original statement that he's never needed anyone at his company to tell him how to do his job. You can draw any conclusion out of it and try to make it fit within that framework, but you have to understand what the text is actually asking. Otherwise, you're, as commonly happens when we're criticizing a religion or making a point, is we presuppose our beliefs and then insert them onto a text to make it say something that the author never intended to say. And that's what's going on here. Okay, so this text is telling us that no one can comprehend God's mind, serve as counselor, or place him under any obligation. Okay, and turning that into a statement that God cannot have a father is simply making the text answer a question that Paul is simply not asking.
Of what verse 36 says, for from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be glory forever. Amen. Now, most Latter-day Saints would say, well, I agree with that. Most people that I talk to would say, absolutely, we believe that. But I like to really press them on this issue. In Mormonism, matter and intelligence are eternal. God organized our universe, but he did not bring the basic building block materials into existence. They've been self-existent for all of eternity past. But Paul here worships God by saying, for from him are all things. All things includes matter. All things includes intelligence. Everything that exists because God brought it into existence. So I like to tell people, is Paul meaning to say that all things are from him except for literally the building blocks of everything? I don't think that makes much sense.
And right back at it again, we have the content creator getting the text to answer a question that is simply not asking. Okay, we're not talking about the nature of matter and how that's created. I actually have a video on this subject that you can watch. I actually talk about this. It's talking about the very first verse in the Bible with create. The scholarship clearly shows that a better rendition is not in the beginning in the absolute sense of creation, that everything comes from God, but rather simply in a beginning, or not even in beginning. Another better rendition is simply when God began creating. This is actually in the NRSV UE rendition of the Bible, which is hailed as probably being the most academic biblical source that you can look at to understand the exegesis of the text and what the original authors were actually trying to convey. I highly recommend that video if you want a little bit more of an in-depth on this, especially relative to the Genesis account. I recommend this book. I actually have a review on this book. It's called The Lost World of Genesis 1, Ancient Cosmology and the Origins Debate. So this author, John Walton, actually is Christian, and to be fair, he actually does believe that God created literally everything and that all things are from him and that matter is not eternal. So I do want to be intellectually honest and say that. But as a scholar, he points out that Genesis simply does not say that, and that the idea of all matter being created by God, everything, and that is not eternal, is a much later reinterpretation of what God has done that gets a lot more into the Greco-Roman era, where people were very influenced by Greek philosophy and Greek thought. You have a number of the early church fathers that are really versed in Greek philosophy that start to kind of go down this road where this idea of God becomes a lot more ethereal, everywhere but nowhere, totally omniscient, omnipotent. It's a different ontology than us as human beings. But biblical scholarship emphatically says that this is not how the writers of the Old Testament especially viewed God. They viewed God as an actual human being in some of the text. What's interesting is there's actually different layers of how different cultures that wrote in the Old Testament, how they viewed God. That's a huge subject, very fascinating if you get into that. But when we clearly see in the New Testament, we get a little bit more evolution in how people are understanding God. But using the text within the Bible that we have to argue that matter is actually eternal is not going to fit in the Bible itself. This is a later development, okay? So you might look at this text that says, for from him and through him and to him are all things, okay? But we're not talking about creation here. We're not, he's not giving a theological treatise on how creation happened. He's praising God, okay? Again, the content creator is making the text answer a question that it's not asking, and he is simply wrong when it comes to creation.